Hello, Lazer. It's great to chat with you. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So, start us off. Why don't you make the best case you can for PR in 30 seconds or less?
I would put it like this. When you walk into a trade show, right, and there's hundreds, maybe more companies there, you see one, you see the brand, and you say, oh, wow, that's a great company, or those guys are stars. That's PR. That's the result of PR. Assuming that you are not a client, that you don't have any firsthand experience working with this company, that is PR. Now, I live and work in Israel. There are 10,000 startups here. Actually, literally 10,000 startups here. When somebody mentions they're running through startups, you might not have heard of 5, 10, 50 of them. They get to a name and you say, oh, wow, I've heard of those guys. They're cool. That is the result of PR, and that's PR at its best.
So is PR the equivalent of awareness, or it's a piece of awareness, would you say?
Yeah, it's awareness with a certain connotation around it. Awareness with reputation, awareness. PR is how you want to be seen. And yes, at its best, that's where it is. That's what it is. And that's what it could do.
Cool. So let's break it down a little further, and we're going to be very tactical in this episode. Let's start at the basics. Can you talk about the different types of media outlets that are out there, and maybe even a little bit more broadly, like the different components of PR, because it's somewhat of a general term that incorporates multiple aspects.
Yeah, I would start by defining what I mean by PR. PR means a lot of things to a lot of different people. What I mean in this context is earned media coverage for, specifically in my case, tech companies, right? By earned media coverage, I mean working with a company, with a client, and the media to set up an interview or a Q&A, or a podcast appearance, which will result in them in a story about them, a feature being included in a story, being a guest on a podcast. That's what we mean by PR in this context. And the different types of PR and the different audiences, that very much depends on where you are, what industry you're in, who your target audience is, what stage you are, what stage your company is. It's often the highest level of media that you could get based on the stories that you could produce, but it's also where you want to be and where you want to be seen. So it's the approach we'll usually take is to get as broad media coverage as possible, as well as making sure that we're being seen by the industry. You know, if you're an enterprise software startup, so you want to be in TechCrunch, you'd love to be on Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, and you possibly could in very specific contexts, which we might get into. And then you also want to be on the Newsstack and InfoQ and SD Times and those type of publications. And each of those have a different tactic, different strategy, different approach, different types of stories for each of those. And that's really the expertise and even the art of PR.
But key is that we're talking about earned media specifically, and the goal is typically awareness and some sort of authority or trust, right? That the publication is, by featuring this company, this founder, whatever it is applying a stamp of approval, or at least some sort of credibility halo, right?
Exactly. Brand awareness, thought leadership. Yes.
How does PR support other channels, and also timing? And we're going to get into this, kind of at each stage of the startup journey, specifically because we're a show about startups. So we're going to talk about PR specifically from the perspective of startups. But at a high level still, how does PR support other channels and the timing of launching other channels?
I don't view PR generally as a lead generation platform. That is one of the side benefits of PR, but that is not the main benefit. Now, it certainly could, though, and it certainly does at times. And when, for example, you're launching a new product and the main, or a new software solution, and the main goal in the short term is signups, PR is very much a part of that. And you're going to want to have everything aligned and everything set up to maximize impact, so that the product launch will be aligned with an ideal public relations calendar, which means that it might not happen this week or next week because it's a big trade show or Apple's making a big announcement, or the like. But PR will amplify all the other efforts you're making, and then part of a savvy marketer will also use a whole host of tactics to amplify the news coverage that they get. So most obvious would be your social media channels, places like Hacker News, Reddit, other groups and forums, but also referral links and other such tools that will take this media coverage and amplify it, and also more directly target it to your audience.
That's an interesting piece of the PR strategy around amplifying, right, what happens after the story is featured. But let's stick with kind of the early stages of a startup's journey. If you can kind of, I know that there's no easy prescriptive answer that can be generalized in most cases, but if you can try your best to provide specific advice to startups at each stage, whether it's from pre-seed, starting with like the coming soon, do you want to do that as an early stage startup that's maybe in beta or even in some sort of stealth mode? Do you want to do some coming soon buzz? Then we can talk about the launch and potentially launching on a platform like Product Hunt or Kickstarter or something like that. But what are your thoughts at the earliest stages? Where does PR come in?
Yeah, timing is very important, of course. And often at the early stages, you're not quite yet ready for PR. I think as a general rule, we usually advise that your PR efforts, and again, with the caveat that I'm talking about PR with an agency, you would usually want it to coincide to having actually a product that people can sign up for, having something actionable. The coming soon buzz is best created organically. It's best created through industry networks, through social media platforms, both because that's where you're likely to have the most success, but also because most journalists will not be interested in reporting on something that's going to happen at some point in the future, unless the founders previously were the executives at a major tech company. There isn't really a great interest in the next project that you're going to do. The need for PR really starts after funding, and a client will generally get in touch with us when they're at the stage of closing a round, or they previously closed a round, now they're ready to come out of stealth, and that's when PR becomes relevant, and that's when we would start generally working with them to prepare for their first big announcement.
Got it. And how do you start that conversation? Is it always around goals? Like we started, our discussion around what's the purpose of PR. Is that your first conversation that you have with a client of like, what are you trying to accomplish here with PR?
Yes, that's certainly a big part of our initial conversation. But when we start working with someone in that context, in that framing, where they have a product, they have funding, and now they're ready to announce it to the world, it has a very clear-cut goal, and it's very defined, and you have a very clear-cut story. And it's also often the best time to start, because you can hit the ground running on a very specific project. We'll often build a relationship and build a chemistry with this company. So it's a very good context to start the relationship.
So funding obviously is often a milestone that gets announced. Startups will also release press releases around awards, product launches, key hires. How do these all fit in within kind of when you're thinking about crafting a story for a startup, and also putting yourself in the shoes of a journalist? What do they care about? What's interesting to them to write about? And I guess within that, kind of a follow-up question is, like, are press releases still important? Are they dead? Should startups be releasing on the wire these updates on a regular basis?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions there, but they do all connect nicely. Firstly, when there's two basic types of outreach that a PR or company would do, a PR firm or company would do with journalists. Number one is a news in response to a news story. A company has a news story, and how do we maximize this, and how do we get this out to journalists and get the maximum coverage? The other type is proactive outreach, which I believe is the more innovative, creative side of PR, and really where a great PR person, a great PR firm can stand out. Going to the news, right? Assuming that we have this news story, whether it's, like you said, you give some examples, whether it's funding or hire or awards or anything like that. Again, I divide it into two broad categories. Number one is newsworthy releases, right? A story that is of interest to the media. And the other side is the other part is a news wire release, right? This is something that it's great. It's good for the corporate drumbeat. It's good to put out a certain amount of stories out there that show that this company is doing things. It's good for SEO and all sorts of other purposes. But it's not something that would interest journalists. Generally, a hire, in most cases, would fall into the second category. An award, even more so, right? Because many news outlets have their own awards, so they're not interested in promoting an award by another organization or by another media outlet. A hire is, unless the person is known, is very well known on their own, or comes from an executive, a top position at one of the major tech companies, there's generally going to be very little interest. There are other stories, certain product releases, certainly funding, where these are certainly newsworthy, and then it's the job of the PR professional to create this narrative that is of interest to journalists, and for journalists to see it and view it as being of interest to their readers, and then it goes to the question of, okay, how do you best tell this story? What's the format? And I do believe that a press release is still a good format to tell the story. First of all, it helps you put all the information in one easily digestible format, right? Press releases are used in one of three ways, right? The first is that journalists who take the press release and pretty much use it as is, right? They might even print it with the spelling mistakes, right? So that's the most basic form. It's usually lower level media outlets that will just publish the press release with maybe some very minor edits or variations. The second one, and this is syndication, but also there are media outlets that will not market as a press release, they'll market as a news story, but just publish it as but just use the press release. The second type, and with this one is a very wide spectrum, is that the press release is the main basis for the article, but then the journalists will go and do their work to build on top of it. So you're providing them with background information, you're providing them with a quote, which they'll use often, you're providing with statistics, data, and technical information. They're taking that information, and then what they might do is they might also do an interview with that. They might send in a couple of questions. They might just do some research online, and then they'll build their own story, but using the press release as a major basis for the story. The third type of usage of the press release is for very high level publications that will take this information almost as a pitch, and then go and then from there go and research their own story. They might speak to 3 or 5 or 10 experts, and they might end up with a story that's completely different, but this is just the basis. So for that third category, the press release, it's not very necessary, but it's still, a lot of journalists do think in those terms. So if you reach out to them and you pitch them and you say, here, we've got this story, they say, great, let me see a press release. So even for them, it's handed out the press releases. But for the other two categories, which is the majority of stories in tech publications, the press release is still vital.
Interesting that even for the third category, and I like how you broke it apart there, even in that case where this press release isn't being used as the story, it's just the pitch, it's just the excuse to engage and then create a new story off of that some journalists are still asking for a release in that case. I find that interesting. I just want to remind people that oftentimes we think as, client side, being in a startup, you think like a journalist are doing you a favor by covering you. You have to remember that you're also doing them a favor because they have a job to fill pages or fill, eyeballs online. And giving them a good story is helping them with their job, right? So it's definitely a mutually beneficial relationship when done well, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely my attitude. I really view myself as a resource for journalists, and every engagement that I have with a journalist, whether I'm WhatsApping them or emailing them or we're at this stage calling them, that's the tone, and that's the way I communicate, because that's what I feel, that I'm a resource for journalists.
But then on the flip side, you have people that I had a client recently that put out a new video uh, about the company, and they wanted to get press coverage for that. And I was like, if you want to put out a press release on that, go right ahead. But I don't know if that's newsworthy.
You're speaking to a very important part of PR, and this goes on both sides, from the agency side as well as from the company, from the marketer side. There, a part of the job of the agency or of the PR professional is to tell the client or tell the CEO that something is not newsworthy. I mean, a big part of it is define what's newsworthy, but there are cases where it's simply not newsworthy, and that's their job to tell them that, and it has to be done. But the trap is that you can only do that when you've built up enough credibility by getting news coverage in cases where stories were newsworthy. So if you're sitting there and every story that's brought to you, you're explaining why it's not newsworthy, you'll very quickly find that you're redundant. But if you are getting stories, both from newsworthy stories as well as proactively in situations where somebody might have not even thought for a story, then you've now built the credibility and you've built a clout to say, yeah, sorry, this award or this VP hire or this video is just not interesting.
Right. I want to drill into that proactive side of PR that you've mentioned. You described it as the more interesting or more creative side. So talk to us about what that looks like practically, and how's that different from the category of what you called news or news stories?
Yeah, and I think this is especially relevant to earlier stage companies, right? There's almost two completely different parts of PR. There's like what I would refer to as PR, pure PR, and then there's a media relations role, right? So when you're working for a larger company, especially one of the giant tech companies, you're managing incoming, you're managing inquiries, you're managing incoming inquiries, as well as press events where there's a huge built-in interest. You might be working for a company that just the email address is just, you might be working for a company that the email address alone is going to get your email opened. And that's one very important part of public relations or media relations. And there's definitely those who are experts at that and do it better, and those that have less expertise in that area. For early stage companies, at any given time, you don't necessarily have news stories, right? You don't have product releases. You don't have clients to highlight. You don't have data available. And for companies like that, oftentimes you can see, I have conversations very often with clients or potential clients where they say, I'm not ready for PR. And there are cases where you aren't ready for PR. Maybe we'll talk about that as well. But oftentimes you just have to be more creative. And that's where a good PR pro or a good PR agency could direct you in creating these stories. And it happens in a few different ways. Number one is finding news stories where you might not have been aware, right? So somebody who's super plugged into what's going on the product side, on the sales side, on the partnership side, they'll see stories where you might not otherwise have seen it. I had a story once with a software testing company where they did an integration with Kubernetes, and that's just standard at that time. They just saw it as standard. But by understanding their product, by understanding the landscape, we were able to point out to them that this was the first of its kind and leverage that into a story for TechCrunch, right? So first of all, it's about flagging those news stories that others might not have seen. The other side is manufacturing news stories, right? And that can be done through all sorts of ways. The most obvious is surveys. It might be through engaging with regulatory bodies. The other part of it is, newsjacking, being plugged into the trends. An obvious example, as we're recording this now, is ChatGPT, right? It's everywhere. It's being discussed. It's being discussed constantly. And it's, do you have something to say? Now, I will say with ChatGPT is two sides to this, right? On the one hand, everybody's writing about it, so it's a great opportunity. On the other hand, everybody is writing about it, so it's completely flooded. So you do have to be really clever and really smart. But yeah, those are the different types of proactive approaches to the media as well as others. And with that, when you look at your pipeline and you might not see any stories, you might see 2 stories for the entire year, you can have continuous coverage throughout the year.
That's I'm glad you brought up newsjacking, and let's use that example with ChatGPT. Obviously, everybody's talking about it now, and on this podcast, we've been doing a lot of discussions around AI and generative AI. Let's make it practical, though, for a startup. In order for a startup to get coverage in that conversation, so TechCrunch or whoever is writing an article about generative AI, and they're looking for input. Right, someone like yourself or a firm, any good firm will be plugged into that and know somehow, whether it's a Harrow or just by having those direct relationships, know that so and so publication is looking for comment on this topic. How does a startup get inserted into that conversation? Is it by their relevance, by their expertise? Like if I'm an AI startup in a completely different field, will I have something interesting to say about ChatGPT? Not necessarily. So how does that work practically?
I think there's 2 parts of that. First of all, you have to have the expertise, right? And you have to be able to say something different and something that's truly being something new to the conversation. It's something that can't be outsourced. I always say that thought leaders need to do thought leadership, meaning that companies that hire content writers to write thought leadership pieces, I think that very rarely works and often leads to a lot of frustration. We generally, as a rule, don't write thought leadership articles just because we aren't thought leaders, right? We can repackage things that other people have written already, but that's not very interesting. So,
well, you're a thought leader in your space. You're not a thought leader in your client space.
Exactly. We are not engineers and cybersecurity experts. So there's having the expertise. The other side is the practically. How do you get it to journalists and how do you get that into the publications? And that's a few things. Like you said, some of it's built on relationships. You know journalists, they know you, they know the resources that you have available, and they might reach out directly. It's also being in the right place at the right time, right? So we had very recently a journalist at MIT Technology Review, which I consider to be one of the very top 2 or 3 tech publications. I will not say which the other 2 or 3 are.
Publication, yeah.
Exactly. And I just happened to reach out because what was going on in the search place, in the semantic search place, as it relates to ChatGPT, was very relevant to one of my clients who had very serious expertise in that space. I reached out, and this journalist was literally closing Will Haven. He was closing out a story on that exact topic. Great. We set up an interview the next day. And this fantastic company I work with, Pinecone, was very prominently featured in the story. So sometimes it's just being very plugged into what's going on and being in the right place at the right time. Other times you are suggesting the story to the journalist. You're bringing a unique angle and suggesting the story to the journalist, and you're making yourself or your client available as a resource to comment on that story. So there's a lot of different approaches here, but they all come down to expertise. They all come down to expertise, both from the thought leader as well as from the people that are representing the company.
Awesome. So we talked about announcements and press releases. We've talked about thought leadership and newsjacking. I think we can probably skip over crisis management, which hopefully is not a big part of early stage PR. Is probably more for later stage companies. But if you have a comment on that, we can touch on that.
Yeah. Generally, the media wants to first build you up before they destroy you. So we deal with that from time to time, but that's the exception.
Got it. What about rebrandings, or I guess that's kind of like a launch. Anything specific to that you want to talk about? I know you guys just recently went through a rebranding, so congratulations on that. I love the new name, the new branding you guys have at Concrete Media. So any thoughts on rebrandings as it relates to PR?
Thank you very much. I would just say something very brief as it relates to PR, that a rebranding itself, again, unless we're talking about the very biggest brands in the world, is not going to be newsworthy. So what you want to do is you want to attach that to another event that is newsworthy, and then just from a SEO perspective, as well as from a news perspective, you can kind of hitch your ride to that and get coverage for the rebranding for the new name.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that we should dive into that as a good segue, because we talk about newsworthy as if it's this very specific, defined thing. And I'm nodding my head because I've kind of been through the ropes, and obviously you're an expert in this field, so you know what it means. But let's break it down a little bit for the audience. Like, newsworthy typically, in my mind, is about a story, right? You're telling a story. So how do you craft a startup story? Where do you start? We talked about a lot of different tactical pieces, but overall they should fit in with a broader theme or narrative that you're trying to create as a company. So how do you come up with that? Is that the PR firm's job? Is that the startup's job? Should the founder's personal story be a part of that? When does it make sense? When does it not make sense? Talk to me about storytelling.
Yeah, you've talked about you've had some experience. I think it's worth mentioning that the very first tech company I ever worked with was your digital currency company that you launched a very long time ago, easily over 10, 12 years ago. And at that point, I was not aware of a publication called TechCrunch. I certainly was not aware of an idea called digital currency. So we've, in a sense, been on this road together.
So I'll tell you from my perspective, the story was how outrageous it was, right? That was what people tuned in on. The journalist that I spoke to and approached about that startup, nobody was talking about digital currency. I mean, Bitcoin was kind of just maybe it was at $1.50 then, and it was just kind of in some Reddit pages and some tech publications. But for the most part, it was, hey, you're trying to build something crazy here, and that became the story, right? And that's how we pitched it, as opposed to it's another company that raised funding that's hiring VPs of whatever, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that was the interest. And I think in your case, it was about finding the very specific journalist that was interested in that story from that angle, and that's a crucially, vitally important part of what we do. But the first thing to remember when crafting a story, and let's say crafting a press release, because that's usually the format by which we tell this story, is that your audience is first the journalist. The journalist, while the audience ultimately is your target user and the wider public, the journalist is the gatekeeper. And if you don't get past them, you're not going to get to their audience, and you're not going to get in front of your target audience. So that's always the biggest mental shift that marketers need to make when they're so focused on how to tell the story in the context of very specific pain points that a very small group of people experience and identify with. And they have to realize they have to tell the story that the journalist is interested in, and the journalist is interested in the story that their wider audience is interested in. So that's the first place that we have to come to. I think there's a lot of other parts of it. I think, again, yes, people throw this around, but you are really telling a story, and a story is not here's a product that does something marginally better than what's out there, or another product, or here's a product that saves you 15%. That's never a story, right? A story is, you have to build it, you have to explain the pain points, what it's addressing as much as possible on a human level, on a relatable level, and then present the solution as something that's completely different and completely new, right? I mean, the word news obviously comes from the word new. So if there isn't something new here, if there isn't something first, if there isn't something that's just different, it's not going to be of much of interest to anyone.
Do you have buckets that you put the types of stories into? Like, you have like a new technology story, so it's about innovation and it's about doing something interesting, or this is about a disruption story, and it's about like they're going to take on the big guys, or this is about a societal story where this company is trying to solve climate change or poverty or whatever, like those kind of models.
There are angles that I think of it more in terms of angles, right? So it could be a human interest angle, it could be a social angle. But what's Yeah. What's important, by the way, what's important as well is, and a big part of storytelling is show, don't tell, right? We'll often send a press release draft in, and the feedback we get is there's not enough oomph, there's not enough wow, right? And what people have in mind is let's get a few more words in there, like revolutionary or disruptive or other sorts of hyperbole like that. And it's explain why it's innovative. Explain it to us, and then we'll understand.
Yeah, that's a particular pet peeve I hear often from journalists. They don't want to hear your superlatives. Keep the hyperbole to yourself. Explain to me what is happening, and I'll decide if it's disruptive. I'll decide if it's newsworthy, right? So just tell me the what and the why should I care without all the buzzwords around it. I'll do that part as a journalist.
This might be the most vitally important part of public relations and good public relations is to understand just how competitive it is, right? And you can speak to any journalist. They're getting between 30 and 300 pitches a day, right? So anything you're throwing at them, they've seen already. And if you're not telling a story better than 90 to 95% of the other people out there, you're not going to get any play.
Right. And I'm sure it has partly to do with the relationship, right? If you have that trust with the journalist, whether as a direct relationship or through an agency, that trust gives you the benefit of the doubt that they're not going to waste my time with a nothing burger. This let me read this press release and see what it's about, right? So should every startup have a PR firm, or when should startup engage with a PR firm? And I know that you run one, so we're not trying to run an advertisement for your company necessarily, but I definitely encourage folks in Israel to engage with you. But how do I know if I'm ready as a startup founder?
I would say like this: no, not every startup needs a PR firm. If you've raised some money and you're coming out of stealth, I think every company should maximize that opportunity at least. And if they could work with a PR firm on a project basis to just do that announcement, that's something that I would definitely encourage. It's a unique opportunity to announce your first funding, to come out of stealth, to announce yourself to the world, and you absolutely have to maximize it. There are certainly cases where it would not be relevant for a company to have a PR firm. And if you're let's say a dev tool, right, and you're doing something very particular, it's a niche thing that not everyone understands, and also doesn't connect to any other larger trends out there or any other better known tools out there, you might have a very hard time getting any coverage and certainly getting any value that will lead back to you. So there are companies like that in that position that are not ready for that do not have the type of solution that needs a PR firm or that would benefit from a PR firm. Also, a company has to be very clear-eyed that they have the bandwidth to support a PR firm. The success that we have for our clients could be directly correlated to how much time and energy and the priority that they put on PR, right? We're doing the heavy lifting, but we certainly need a partner within the company. And if a company doesn't have a head of marketing, or if the head of marketing is already being pulled in 100 different directions, or if it's simply PR is not priority number 1, 2, 3, it's number 20 or 30, then they'll simply never get to it, and they don't have time to support PR, and thus they won't get much value from PR.
I'm glad you brought that up. That was going to be one of my next questions around who in the company should be involved. So you mentioned the head of marketing. Does the CEO typically need to be involved? I'm assuming certainly when it comes to the thought leadership and getting quotes, getting interviews, it's usually the CEO that you're putting front and center. Anybody else on the team that you'd want to be involved either on an ongoing basis or at least in the beginning?
It very much depends on the size of the company. Early stage company, it might be the CEO that's taking the direct lead. Then usually with time, as the company continues to grow, they'll take a step back. You'll be working directly with the head of marketing, and with a larger company, you might be working with the head of comms or somebody else within the company. I think the CEO should keep a certain relationship with PR, and usually when there is a major story or there is an opportunity for an interview or a podcast appearance or something along those lines, the CEO will take a direct involvement in that. in terms of others that you should be engaging with, the PR people should, as much as possible, integrate themselves within the company so that they're speaking to the head of sales and head of product and the head of partnerships. And as I mentioned before, they know what's coming down the pipeline, and they could advise on what's newsworthy and what stories to tell.
I love that piece. So having the PR firm have full exposure to the entire organization, so they know what might be coming up, and not necessarily relying on the head of marketing to just be a gatekeeper for that. That's an interesting.
One of the best tools, or one of the best weapons that a PR firm has is a case study, right? A client that is using the product. Now, in order to get approval from a client to talk or be part of this case study or be interviewed for a story, the customer relations person needs to sell that to them, right? It needs to, through their personal relationship, get their buy-in. I mean, even if it's in the contract, you still need to have a willing participant on the other side. So the PR person needs to be working with the salespeople, with the customer success people, and selling them on the vision of PR, selling them on the benefit to them as well as the rest of the company in this coverage, and getting them to get the buy-in from their client. So that's just one example of why public relations people need to be in contact with different people within the company.
Got it. And then engaging with a firm, is it typically on a project basis, or do you engage with a firm on an ongoing basis? What's the typical model for startups engaging with PR firms?
There's different models. We generally work on retainer on an ongoing basis. There are other, from time to time, we take projects specifically around funding announcements, something we have a lot of expertise. We've done, I think, about 60 or 70 of those in the past 5 years. There are other firms that work on a performance basis. I don't do that, and if I had more time, I could explain why I don't. As well as on per project. Again, not something that we do, but there are definitely different models out there.
Any pros and cons to one versus the other?
Well, I would just, let's say, to give the example of a performance-based model, right, which seems to be the best one, right? When a company's looking to hire a PR firm, that seems to be the best. You get me coverage, and I only pay for what I get, and you're motivated then to get me coverage. Well, it doesn't exactly work like that, right? Because if I have, just for example, I have 5 clients that are on retainer, and they're paying me every month to get results, and they expect to see those results at the end of the month, and I have a responsibility to get those results. What are the chances that at the end of the day, I'm going to have time to go and pitch your story with the hope that I'll get a result out of that, which will then get me paid, right? The other side of that as well is that another part of that as well is that a PR firm could be motivated to only really push stories that are easy stories and not push the ones that are harder, which oftentimes the ones that are harder, that's when you really want the expertise of the PR agency. So again, motivations don't always align as you would think, and that's why personally that's something that I stay away from.
Lazer, that's all really good advice and really applicable to especially early stage startups. Any final thoughts or advice that you'd like to share with founders or with marketers, growth professionals at startups thinking about their PR strategy?
Yeah, sure. This has been a lot of fun, and just the last thought. I mean, I all areas of marketing are important, and they enhance each other and work together. But while I am biased, I would say that PR can have the biggest impact when done right. Just to give a little thought experiment, when you write a blog, so if it's written slightly better, it could maybe convert another 10% or another 15% of people, right? Can have slightly more impact. A press release, if it's written right, or a story, if it's told right, it can get you on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, right?
Thank you for that, Lazer. I really appreciate it. Your knowledge and expertise in this area speak for themselves in the results that you get for your clients. Thank you for sharing with us. It's great to see you as always. Great to talk with you, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks so much, Moshe.